I never anticipated a single evening could alter everything, but that's precisely what occurred when I found myself alone with my father-in-law, Henry. It was meant to be an ordinary night, but life occasionally throws unpredictable curveballs, moments that make you question everything you thought you knew. I was simply his son-in-law, married to his daughter Lisa, living a predictable life. Yet, an unspoken tension simmered between us, intensifying with each shared glance, each exchanged word. What followed was unimaginable, yet unstoppable. It all started when I married Lisa. We'd been together for a few years before tying the knot, and I'd met her family numerous times. Her father, Henry, always struck me as kind, respectful, and slightly intimidating. A tall, broad-shouldered man, he possessed a quiet authority that commanded attention. He was the type whose silence spoke volumes. Initially, I didn't give him much thought. He was my father-in-law, Lisa's dad. He was polite, courteous, and always inquired about my work or life during family dinners. Nothing out of the ordinary, but one particular evening, things began to shift in unforeseen ways. Lisa was away on a business trip, leaving me at her family home for a few days. Her mother was visiting her sister, so it was just Henry and me under the same roof. The situation felt slightly awkward. I wasn't accustomed to being alone with him, and the silence between us seemed to stretch endlessly. We made small talk, work, football, the weather, typical pleasantries. But one evening, something changed. After dinner, I was in the living room, flipping through TV channels, when Henry entered, a glass of whiskey in hand. He sat opposite me, and his usually calm eyes held an unfamiliar intensity. We chatted briefly, but the air crackled with tension. I felt his gaze linger, and for inexplicable reasons my heart began to race. "You seem quiet tonight," he observed, his deep voice cutting through the silence. I shrugged, unsure how to respond. "Just thinking about work, I guess." He nodded, but his gaze remained fixed. His sharp eyes studied me, leaving me feeling strangely exposed. "You know," he began, swirling the whiskey in his glass, "I've always admired your composure. You're responsible. Lisa's fortunate to have you." I smiled awkwardly, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "Thank you. I try." He leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "But there's more to you, isn't there? More than you show." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. My throat tightened, and I looked away, suddenly self-conscious. "I'm not sure what you mean," I mumbled, my voice betraying my unease. He paused before answering, taking a long sip of his whiskey, his eyes still on me. "You're a good man," he finally said, his voice softening. "But sometimes even good men have desires they don't talk about." A chill ran down my spine, and my pulse quickened. His look, his words, hinted at something beyond casual conversation. I attempted to laugh it off. "We all have things we don't talk about, I guess." He chuckled, a low, deep sound. "True enough." An uncomfortable silence descended, and I shifted uncomfortably, acutely aware of his gaze. I didn't understand why, but the tension between us was undeniable, something unspoken that I wasn't prepared to confront. Later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us. I replayed the conversation, questioning if I'd imagined the intensity in his eyes, the hidden meaning in his words. But the more I considered it, the more certain I became that I hadn't been mistaken. The next day things seemed normal, at least superficially. We had breakfast, exchanged pleasantries, and went about our day as if nothing had happened. But beneath the surface I still felt the tension, the unspoken connection that had altered in some inexplicable way. That evening, as we sat in the living room again, the tension thickened. He sat closer this time, close enough that I could detect the faint scent of his cologne mingled with whiskey. He didn't speak, but his presence felt heavier. Then, just as I thought the night would pass in silence, he leaned in, his voice a near whisper. "You're thinking about last night, aren't you?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. How did he know? How could he tell his words had haunted me all day? I tried to feign ignorance, my heart hammered in my chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." But he didn't believe me. His eyes locked onto mine, and I knew I couldn't escape the truth. Something had shifted between us, something undeniable. And strangely, I wasn't certain I wanted to, but that wasn't the end. There was more, so much more I hadn't even begun to comprehend. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to convince myself I'd overanalyzed the situation, that the encounter with Henry was nothing more than a bizarre, fleeting moment. But no matter how hard I tried to suppress the memory, it resurfaced. His words, his gaze, the way he'd leaned in, as if on the verge of saying or doing something more. It played on repeat in my mind. Lisa was still away, and I found myself spending more time alone with Henry than I was comfortable with. I tried to avoid him, but we inevitably ended up together, at the dinner table, in the living room. The palpable tension between us lingered, like a gathering storm. One evening, after another long, silent dinner, Henry suggested we watch a movie. I hesitated but didn't want to appear rude. Besides, it would provide a distraction from the awkwardness. So I agreed. We sat at opposite ends of the couch, the TV flickering in the dim room. I tried to concentrate on the film, but I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. Each time I glanced over, I found him watching me, his expression unreadable. My heart raced, my palms sweated, and I shifted uneasily. Halfway through the movie, the tension became unbearable. I felt suffocated by its intensity. I needed to break the silence. "I think I'll head to bed," I mumbled, standing abruptly. But before I could escape, he reached out and grasped my arm, halting me. His grip was firm yet not forceful. A jolt of fear, excitement, and confusion surged through me. "Wait," he said softly, his voice low and almost pleading. "We need to talk." I froze, my mind racing. I didn't want to have this conversation, to acknowledge what was happening between us, but his eyes told me I couldn't avoid it any longer. Reluctantly, I sat back down, my heart pounding, bracing myself. He didn't release my arm immediately. His touch lingered a moment too long before he finally let go, his hand falling to his side as he leaned back, his gaze unwavering. "You've been avoiding me," he stated, his voice calm but laced with something deeper, darker. I swallowed, trying to feign nonchalance. "I've just been busy with work." He shook his head slowly, a humorless smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Don't lie to me. We both know something has changed between us." There it was. The undeniable truth laid bare. My heart pounded, my throat tightened, and panic washed over me. I didn't know how to respond, how to process the turbulent emotions within me. "I don't know what you mean," I said, but my trembling voice betrayed me. He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You do know. You felt it, just like I did." I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, the walls closing in. I wanted to run, to escape the conversation, but something kept me rooted to the spot, unable to move, unable to look away from him. "What are you talking about?" I whispered. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached out again, his fingers brushing the back of my hand. It was a simple touch, seemingly innocent, yet it sent a shockwave through me, igniting something deep within. "I've seen the way you look at me," he said softly, his eyes boring into mine. "The way you avoid me, the way you tense up whenever I'm near. You're scared of what this is, but you don't have to be." I pulled my hand away, the sudden loss of contact both a relief and strangely unsettling. My mind spun, my emotions a tangled mess of confusion, fear, and something else I didn't want to admit. "This is wrong," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "You're my father-in-law. I'm married to your daughter." He nodded slowly, as if expecting that response. "I know, but that doesn't change what's happening here between us. You can't deny it." I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, that whatever I'd felt was just a misunderstanding. But the words wouldn't come. Deep down, I knew he was right. There was something between us, something frightening, something I didn't want to acknowledge, yet couldn't ignore. "I don't know what to do," I admitted, my voice trembling as the weight of the situation crashed down. He leaned closer, his eyes softening slightly. "You don't have to do anything right now. Just let yourself feel it. Don't run from it." The tension between us was almost unbearable, thick enough to choke me. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to leave, to run from the situation that was spiraling out of control. But I couldn't move, frozen between the urge to escape and the inexplicable pull toward him. "I can't," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't right." He didn't argue, didn't push. He simply looked at me, his gaze deep and penetrating, filled with an emotion I couldn't name. And in that moment I realized he wasn't just my father-in-law anymore. He was something more. Dangerous, forbidden, something I shouldn't want. But I did. The realization hit me hard, leaving me breathless and reeling. I wanted him, despite everything, the wrongness, the betrayal, and I hated myself for it. Before I could speak, he stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked toward the door. He paused, turning back for one last look, his expression unreadable. "When you're ready to talk, I'll be here," he said quietly, before leaving me alone with my thoughts and the overwhelming emotions I'd been trying to deny. As soon as he was gone, I exhaled shakily, my heart still racing. What had just happened? How had things escalated so quickly? My mind spun, torn between fear and the undeniable pull I felt toward him. But this was far from over. We both knew it. There was no escaping the truth. Whatever was happening between us wasn't going away, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to fight it any longer. The storm between us had just begun, and I was already in too deep. The days since our conversation blurred together. The weight of what remained unspoken between Henry and me hung heavy in the air, permeating every room. Lisa was still away, and the more time I spent alone with him, the harder it became to ignore the unspoken tension simmering between us. I'd catch him looking at me, his gaze lingering, as if waiting for me to acknowledge it. But I never did. I couldn't. I didn't trust myself to handle it. The rational part of me insisted it would pass, that this strange attraction would vanish upon Lisa's return. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't. Something had shifted. Something permanent. That evening, the tension was particularly thick. I was in the kitchen, mindlessly stirring pasta, trying to distract myself. The sound of footsteps behind me made my heart jump. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. His presence was palpable, electrifying the air. "You're cooking," Henry observed, his low voice sending shivers down my spine. He stood close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I nodded, concentrating on the pasta, my mind racing. "I thought I'd make something simple. Lisa should be back tomorrow." Mentioning her name felt like a splash of cold water, a stark reminder of reality, of the boundaries we were dangerously close to crossing. But even her name couldn't extinguish the pull I felt toward him. Henry didn't respond to the mention of his daughter. Instead, he stepped closer, his presence filling the small kitchen. "You've been quiet lately," he noted, his tone gentle but probing. I swallowed hard, tightening my grip on the wooden spoon. "I've had a lot on my mind," I murmured. "You're not the only one." His words sent a jolt through me. There it was again, the tension, the pull neither of us seemed willing or able to acknowledge aloud. My heart pounded as I turned off the stove, suddenly struggling to breathe. "I don't think—" I started, but he didn't let me finish. He moved closer, so close I could feel his breath on my neck. My pulse quickened, and I stood frozen, unable to move or think. I knew what was about to happen. I could feel it in the air, in the way he stood just behind me, his presence consuming the space around me. And then he said it, the thing I'd been desperately trying to avoid. "We can't keep pretending this isn't happening," he murmured, his voice low and laced with unspoken, dangerous meaning. I turned slowly, my heart racing, my mind screaming at me to run. But when I looked up at him, when our eyes met, all those thoughts vanished. There was something in his gaze. His gaze held a raw vulnerability I hadn't seen before. It was like looking into a mirror, reflecting the confusion and desire I'd been suppressing. I opened my mouth to speak, to tell him this was wrong, that we needed to stop. But the words wouldn't come. Before I could stop myself, before I could even think, I leaned in. It was a slow, tentative movement, a test. I waited for him to pull back, to stop me, but he didn't. He remained perfectly still, his breath shallow, his eyes locked on mine. And then, our lips met. It was soft at first, barely a kiss, the lightest brush of lips, as if we were both afraid of what it meant. But even that brief touch sent a shockwave through me, igniting something deep inside. I pulled back almost immediately, my heart pounding, my mind spinning. What had I done? I looked up at him, expecting anger, disappointment, something to snap me back to reality. But his gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. For a long moment we simply stood there, the weight of what had happened hanging between us, thick and suffocating. My mind screamed at me to break the silence, but before I could, he leaned in again. This time, it wasn't tentative. His lips pressed against mine with certainty, purpose. For a second I forgot to breathe. Everything around us faded. The kitchen, the house, the world beyond. All that existed was this moment, this kiss, this undeniable thing between us. I kissed him back. It wasn't planned. It wasn't logical. But in that moment, it felt right. My mind screamed at me to stop, to pull away, to remember this was wrong, that he was my father-in-law, that this was a line we should never cross. But I couldn't. The pull was too strong, the desire too overwhelming. After what felt like an eternity, he pulled back, his breathing heavy, his eyes searching mine for understanding, perhaps reassurance. But I didn't know what to say. My heart raced, my mind spun. I could only stand there wondering how things had escalated so quickly. "We need to stop," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "This isn't right." "I know," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "but it's too late to stop now." He was right. It was too late. The kiss had changed everything, taken us past the point of no return. I stepped back, creating some distance, my mind struggling to process what had happened. "Lisa will be back tomorrow," I said, more to remind myself than him. "We can't," but he just looked at me, his eyes filled with an emotion I couldn't name, an emotion that frightened me. "We'll figure it out," he said quietly. I wasn't sure if it was meant to comfort me or make things worse. I nodded, but I didn't believe him. How could we figure this out? How could we undo what had happened, erase the kiss, and pretend everything was normal? We couldn't. I turned away, unable to look at him any longer, and walked out of the kitchen, my heart racing, my mind spinning. But even as I walked away, I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next morning, the house was eerily quiet. The light filtering through the windows felt sharper, every sound magnified. It was as if the walls themselves held the secrets whispered in the darkness. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee, my thoughts tangled, my emotions raw. I hadn't slept. How could I? The kiss with Henry replayed in my mind, a loop I couldn't escape, the feel of his lips, the surrender, the realization we'd crossed a line. None of it would leave me. And today Lisa was coming home. I kept telling myself that once she returned, everything would go back to normal. Henry and I would bury what had happened, pretend it was just a moment of weakness, a meaningless mistake. But deep down, I knew that wasn't possible. The kiss had changed something fundamental, something we couldn't ignore. The sound of footsteps made me tense. I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. Every part of me was hyper-aware of his presence, and even the smallest sound from him sent my heart racing. "Morning," Henry's voice was low, cautious. I didn't look up, afraid to meet his gaze. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite the turmoil within. He moved to the counter, pouring himself coffee. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Neither of us knew what to say. The weight of the previous night hung between us like a shadow. "Lisa's flight gets in around noon," I said, finally breaking the silence. "Lisa's flight gets in around noon," I said, breaking the oppressive silence. I needed to say something, anything, to fill the void. "Right," Henry replied, his voice measured, yet laced with tension. He sat across from me, his eyes studying me carefully. "We need to talk about last night." I finally looked up, my chest tightening. The intensity of his gaze was almost overwhelming. I didn't know where to begin unpacking the mess we'd created. "What's there to talk about?" I asked, my voice softer than intended. "You know what?" he said firmly, but not unkindly. "We can't just ignore it." "I know that," I replied, frustration rising. "But what do you expect me to say? That everything's fine?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not asking you to do that, but we need to figure out where we go from here." Panic swelled in my chest. "There is nowhere to go from here," I said, my voice shaking. "It was a mistake, that's all. We need to leave it behind." His eyes darkened, his jaw tightening slightly. "You think you can just leave it behind, after everything?" Anger and confusion surged through me. "What else can we do? Lisa is coming back. She can't know about this. It would destroy everything." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering. "You're right, she can't know. But that doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change how we feel." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words died on my lips. He was right. As much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't. The attraction, the pull between us, was real, and that terrified me. "As I have said earlier, we need to move past this," I said finally, my voice barely a whisper, "for everyone's sake." He didn't respond immediately, just stared at me with piercing eyes that seemed to see right through me. Finally, he nodded, a resigned expression on his face. "I understand," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean it'll be easy." I didn't answer. I didn't know how to. There was no easy way out of this mess. All I could do was hope that once Lisa returned, the distance between Henry and me would be enough to make this, whatever this was, fade away. The hours crawled by, each minute feeling heavier than the last. Lisa's flight landed on time, and by early afternoon she was home, smiling and laughing as if nothing had changed. I tried to match her energy, to pretend everything was fine, but underneath I felt like I was suffocating. Henry was quieter than usual, keeping his distance, yet never straying too far. Every time our eyes met, I felt the tension crackling between us. It was unbearable. That evening, Lisa suggested we have dinner together, as if to celebrate her return. I agreed, though the thought of sitting at the same table with both her and Henry felt like torture. Throughout the meal, I could barely focus on the conversation. My mind raced, replaying the events of the last few days. The kiss, the tension, everything left unsaid. And then it happened. It was subtle, a small moment, but enough. As I reached for the wine bottle, my hand brushed against Henry's. It was barely a touch, but it felt like a jolt of electricity. I looked up at him, and for a split second, our eyes locked. It was all there in his gaze, the longing, the conflict, the forbidden desire. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over, no matter how hard we tried to pretend. The truth was undeniable. After dinner, Lisa excused herself to take a work call, leaving Henry and me alone in the dining room. The silence was deafening. I could feel my pulse quickening as I sensed him watching me. "It's not fair to her," I said, my voice strained. He nodded, his expression unreadable. "I know. I'm serious," I continued, my frustration boiling over. "I can't keep living like this, with this tension hanging over us. It's going to tear everything apart." "I understand," he said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "But it's not something we can just turn off." For a long moment he stared at me, searching my eyes for something, a way out perhaps, or reassurance that I was equally conflicted. But there was none. I was at my breaking point. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "If that's what you want," he said softly, though his eyes betrayed his emotions. "It's not about what I want," I replied, my voice shaking. "It's about what's right. I love Lisa. I can't betray her like this." He nodded, but I could see the tension in his posture, the tightness in his jaw. "I know you're right." There was a pause, a long silence that felt like an eternity. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone with the weight of everything that had happened. I sank back into my chair, my head in my hands, trying to steady my breathing, to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be made. I was trapped between my love for Lisa and the impossible connection with Henry. As I sat there in the quiet, the reality settled over me. This wasn't something that would simply disappear. It would linger, a shadow following me everywhere. And no matter how much I wanted to forget, No matter how hard I tried to move on, I knew a part of me would always be tied to that night, to that intense moment, and to the man who had changed everything.